Hello, dear listener. Welcome to a 5-part series on the history of the church, brought to you by the Equip Project podcast. Jim, it's been a good few months since we've sat down together at this table. I'm very excited to be back, especially to discuss a topic I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, church history. But before we get into that topic, Jim, I want to know how your summer's been going. And my big question is, have you fully recovered from the terrible sunburn you sustained a few weeks back?
Well, it was actually a thing called sun poisoning. It wasn't just sunburn. So, I got sunburnt on the Monday, and that was fine. And then on the Wednesday morning, I woke up and both my eyes were so swollen I couldn't see out of them. And I looked like an alien. And,
it's actually not funny. I shouldn't be laughing. It's terrible.
No, you should not
I genuinely do feel a lot of empathy for you.
Yeah, quite obviously not. But anyway, I took a course of antihistamines, but I had to cancel my I was supposed to be preaching morning and evening, and I had to get somebody to stand in. So I'm glad you find that very funny.
But you've bounced back, and you're enjoying the rest of your summer. It's going well aside from that?
Well, actually, no, because I'm in a state of mild panic at the moment, because the girl who usually cleans my house traditionally is due to return. I mean, obviously because of lockdown, she hasn't been with me for a year. So yesterday I had to order a large skip to take away about a year's worth of mess, right? So because if I'm to avoid a severe reprimand, everything has to be in order when she returns. So guilt and fear are strong motivators in my life, Ollie. Anyway, you've had a much better time than me, haven't you? You're just back from Scotland.
Yeah, that's right. I was over in Edinburgh, down the east coast of Scotland, and played a few rounds of golf and got to explore the delights of Edinburgh. It's a really nice city, actually, and a beautiful part of the UK. So keen to head back before too long. But while I was there, I got a text from you saying not only were we going to do one episode on church history, but actually we're going to do 5 episodes.
That's right. So
I was very excited when I got that message because, as I say, I've been wanting to do this for a long time.
I was actually chased by the police in Edinburgh.
Really?
Yes.
I've not heard this one.
When we were students, we went busking, and
you went busking in Edinburgh?
Yes.
Wow.
And I had thought to encourage people to give us money. I got some loose change and put it in a cap. And anyway, we weren't allowed. Apparently, we were in a part of Edinburgh under the Scott Memorial. We were not allowed to busk. So I grabbed the cap when we saw the police coming towards us, and a whole lot of the money dropped out. So we were actually the only people ever to lose money busking.
What were you playing? Like, what instrument?
I can't even remember. Different instruments, but it was.
High quality. I never knew that.
Yeah.
I've got a whole new view of you now, Jim. That's amazing.
Anyway, my life is now much less adventurous. In fact, it's so pathetically boring that these recording sessions are the only interesting thing that's going on in my life right now. And mind you, I have to say, Ollie, I wasn't really convinced by the subject matter you've chosen, even though I've now decided we'll do 5 episodes. So the obvious question I want to ask you is, why are we embarking on this special series on church history?
Yeah, as I say, Jim, I'm really glad I've won you over to begin with. But the reason that I felt keen to do something on church history is I think it's a topic that demonstrates that our faith has deep roots. It's not a flimsy faith. It's something that has stood the test of time. It stood against significant opposition over many, many years, a couple of thousand years, in fact. And through all that time, the Lord has protected the gospel, and the truth has stood firm. And in our culture today, people react against history. If you like, they're chronological snobs. And people think that everything that went before is not as good or not as important as the world we live in today. And this is patently false. And I really hope that our short series will demonstrate that.
Yeah, I think that's an important argument. It's always a good thing to understand where we swim in the river of history. You're too young ever to have glanced at the Peanuts cartoon strips that used to be printed in newspapers. But anyway, in one of them, Charlie Brown's little sister Sally is writing an essay on the history of the Christian church. And the essay begins, "When writing about church history, we have to go back to the very beginning. Our pastor was born in 1950. And I think a lot of Christians, particularly if they're independent evangelicals, think like Sally.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think that's a key reason why we should look at this topic. Another reason why it matters is that previous generations of Christians have learned a lot of hard lessons about Christian doctrine. And they produce loads of really, really valuable resources that can actually help us, prevent us, from falling into theological error.
Yeah, I think it was Churchill who said, those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. I think he was actually paraphrasing George Santayana, but anyway. So our Christian ancestors have a lot to teach us as we, in our generation, seek to understand the mysteries of the faith. But I think it's important that we distinguish up front, Ollie. There's a difference between the theological wisdom that has accumulated over the centuries and the ecclesiastical structures that have developed over time. When it comes to the question of church governance, I'm going to put my cards on the table, if I'm allowed to use that phrase. I'm going to declare myself to be an unashamed primitivist. In other words, I believe that the pattern of church life that we find in the New Testament is the normative model for all cultures and historical eras. So I regard the vast organisational and political structures that developed in the medieval church with horror. I really struggle to accept that the thing called Christendom was ever part of God's plan for the church. So for me, the moment when the Roman Emperor Constantine declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman state was a disastrous moment in church history. Now, of course, some of our listeners may hold opposing views, but I just wanted to put my cards on the table at this point. Now, we can be really grateful for the theological resources handed down to us, while at the same time not accepting the political rubble that is left from the collapse of Christendom.
Yeah, and I think we should prepare ourselves for a story that is complex and messy, a story that's full of mistakes and even terrible behavior on the part of people who profess the name of Christ. And I guess that leads on nicely to my final reason for knowing our history as Christians, and that's this. Church history raises a whole set of apologetic issues today, whether it be arguments over so-called suppressed gospels or the Crusades.
You're right, but I don't think we need to adopt a purely defensive posture when it comes to the history of Christianity. When you look at the subject through the right lens, I think it becomes obvious that the thing we call Western civilization is a product of a Christian worldview that developed slowly over many centuries.
Yeah, one concern I do have, though, Jim, when it comes to addressing this topic, is that the story is very complex. It stretches over 2,000 years, and my concern is maybe we'll get a little bit lost. There are so many different ways we can actually think about church history. So some historians focus on the political dramas that dominated the Middle Ages and that eventually produced the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries. Other historians pull out the big names and give us biographies of Augustine, of Al-Salem, of Thomas Aquinas, of Luther, and of Calvin. So how are we going to approach this complicated story?
Well, the Equip project is all about cultural engagement. So I think we should look at this question through the lens of the history of ideas. So I guess I'm tempted to focus more on your final reason for looking at this stuff. In particular, we might think about how the Christian worldview that produced Western civilization came about. So if we pan the camera back completely for a moment, I think there's one main target that we need to have in our gun sights, and that is what we might call the Edward Gibbons theory of Christian history. Edward Gibbons is the author of an incredibly influential work called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and it was published around about the time of the American Revolution. And generations of English public school boys had to plough through all 6 volumes of Gibbons' history, including our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Now, the thing about Gibbons is that he is very anti-Christian. He sneers at Christianity, contrasting it with what he calls the tolerance of paganism or even Islam. In fact, he blames the rise of Christianity for the decline of the Roman Empire. Maybe the best way I can summarize his view of history is to create a word picture here. So, according to Gibbons, the classical world was, a delightful place of sophistication and enlightened thinking. And then Christianity squatted like a gigantic big mosquito on the back of Western world for 1,000 years, poisoning the West with its lies about an afterlife, sucking all innovation and free thinking out of people's minds. It was the giant parasite called Christianity that drugged the West into a state of mental paralysis. For century after century, the Christian church kept men locked in the darkness of superstition. It was a corrupt, anti-intellectual, brutish institution that crushed any hope of human progress for century after century. But then the dawn broke, the shadows flew away, the Renaissance reconnected humanity to the enlightened humanism of the Romans, the classic philosophy of the Greeks, and the great parasite of Christianity fought long and hard, but eventually it was cast off, and the European nations walked into the sunlit uplands of the Enlightenment. Once again, humanity was free to rule by reason alone. The mosquito of Christianity could no longer pump its poison into our veins.
And that view of history is often promoted by the likes of Richard Dawkins, for example. But in more recent times, it's been challenged, hasn't it? By most obviously by Tom Holland and also Rodney Stark.
That's right. But also intellectuals like Luke Ferry has come out against the Gibbons view of history. And a couple of years ago, I struggled through a book called Inventing the Individual, The Origins of Western Liberalism. And it was written by a philosopher called Larry Sedentop. And he makes the same point that historians like Tom Holland have made. In other words, the core ideas that lie at the heart of Western civilization all come from Christianity. They emerge from the mud and the blood and the sheer weirdness of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and Tom Holland's a very interesting character to listen to. I'm sure many of our viewers have watched him interviewed by N.T. Wright or on a Premier Radio's show, Unbelievable. And he describes how he suddenly realized that his worldview wasn't built by the Romans or the Greeks. It was built by the Apostle Paul. And in fact, he said that the ancient Greeks and Roman cultures actually were alien to him. All the beliefs he finds himself at home with are actually derived from the New Testament. And Holland claims that it's Paul's epistles that explain the modern world. Human rights, international law, the value of the individual, all these things that we take for granted, they don't come from the Greeks, says Holland. In fact, they come from Paul and from the Gospels.
There's an amazing moment in the interview when Holland describes Paul as a depth charge that goes off deep within the classical world. And the ripple effects were felt over 1,000 years later. So, as we chart out the development of the Christian worldview over the centuries, I'll be arguing that the Edward Gibbons view of history is quite wrong. In fact, I hope that when we get to the final episode, we'll see that it is secular humanism that has squatted like a giant mosquito on the back of a civilization that was built by Christianity. It is secular humanism that is the parasite in this story, not Christianity.
So that's the goal of this mini-series, Jim, if we make it to the end, all being well. We're planning to publish 5 episodes, and the first 3 will take history in 500-year blocks. So we'll think about the period up to the fall of Rome in 476 AD, then the so-called Dark Ages up to the year 1000 AD, and then we talk about the High Middle Ages, which takes us up to the story of Columbus landing in America at the end of the 15th century. In the final 2 episodes, then, we'll think about the Reformation, before finally considering the rise of evangelicalism.
Break out the popcorn.
Absolutely. Get your snacks ready. This is going to be quite some ride. So in this episode, Jim, we're going to think about the earliest days of the Christian church, from its beginning as an obscure Jewish sect to the point when it emerged as the dominant cultural power of the Roman Empire. The early history of Christianity is completely bound up with the Roman Empire. Right up from the very start. When Luke is recording the story of Jesus' birth, he mentions that Mary and Joseph had to travel to Bethlehem because Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world.
Yes, it actually might be helpful to begin with a really simple summary of Rome's history. By the time of the Lord Jesus' birth, Rome was about 750 years old. In its very early days, it had been ruled by a succession of tyrants. You may remember Tarquin's Superbus. Does that mean anything?
That rings no bells whatsoever in my mind.
Anyway, around about 500 BC, a republic was formed. And over time, a sophisticated system of governance with regional magistrates and consuls and a senate developed. But in later years, the Roman army became incredibly powerful, and its generals started to vie for power, and a bitter civil war broke out between 2 generals. One of them was the famous Julius Caesar, of course. And throughout that period, life for ordinary Romans was just terrible. So everyone heaved a sigh of relief when Augustus was appointed as the first emperor of the Roman Empire. And in terms of geography, the empire, if you like, wrapped itself around the Mediterranean. So in the west, the Roman Empire was bounded by the Atlantic Ocean. The northern boundary was created by the Rhine and the Danube rivers all the way to the Black Sea. So Roman legions were stationed along those rivers for centuries, protecting the provinces from German barbarians. Then as you move east, the empire covered Greece and Turkey, Syria and Israel, Egypt, and then back westward right around the North African coastline. So the empire's southern border was formed by the Sahara Desert. So that was this enormous sprawling territory. And Rome itself was parked way out in the west, which made things difficult, and we'll have to think about that a lot more in the next episode.
Yeah, I remember at university, actually, Jim, studying the history of the Roman legal system. It was incredibly impressive and sophisticated for its time. And I remember at school also, our textbooks were filled, when we studied Rome, the textbooks were filled with these amazing structures, roads and viaducts and so on. They were brilliant engineers as well. It seemed that they were an incredibly impressive society.
In many ways, it was impressive. It was said of Augustus that when he started, Rome was made of brick. By the time he died, it was made of marble. And that is usually how we imagine Rome, or at least how I do. A noble senator like Cicero standing in his purple-bordered toga, speaking wise words about statecraft while other senators sat on marble steps. Or we might think about the literary genius of men like Virgil with his Aeneid. But we shouldn't let the engineering and the cultural brilliance blind us to the fact that Rome ran on a value system that anyone in our culture would find alien.
Yeah, and I do think we are often blind to that fact, Jim. And that point explains Tom Holland's light bulb moment that we discussed earlier. Why were Roman values so alien to our minds today?
Well, to explain that, let me tell you a true story about a young woman called Perpetua. She lived around about the year 200 AD in the North African city of Carthage, which was a Roman province at the time. Perpetua was 22 years old, recently married with an infant child, and she had just become a Christian. And on the orders of the Romans, Perpetua was arrested and then taken to an amphitheatre that was full of the local townspeople. Some had brought packed lunches. All of them were eagerly looking forward to the show. Perpetua and her friend Felicity were brought out into the amphitheatre. The crowd roared as a wild bull gored the two girls. Perpetua was flung high into the air. And although terribly injured, she dragged herself to her feet, tried to rearrange her dishevelled hair, and went to her friend's help. Then a leopard was released into the arena, and it attacked the girls, biting them, tearing their flesh until their clothes were soaked in blood. But the crowd grew impatient. It was taking too long for the animals to kill the girls, so they bayed and stomped their feet until the circus manager gave the order for the girls to be stabbed to death by swordsmen. Now, just as an aside, I can't stop myself from contrasting the story of Perpetua to the stories of deconversion that an increasing number of young adults are publishing on their social media feeds today. Perpetua wrote a diary that recorded the last days of her life in the dungeon. In a moment of mercy, a guard allowed her to nurse her newborn son and breastfeed him. And at that moment she wrote that the dungeon was like a palace. And her final words, the words that sealed her fate, were these: "I am a Christian." Those noble words, I think, echo down the centuries as a rebuke to the self-absorbed hipsters who have come to despise the convictions of a true believer. Now, I'm not making a general point here. Of course, we have to be sympathetic to many of the stories. But far too often, ex-evangelicals who sneer at doctrines such as biblical inerrancy do so to hide their own moral cowardice. Well, look at the naked corpse of a young mother, bloodied and torn by savage animals, and understand what real courage looks like. Now, the thing is, Ollie, I could have recounted hundreds of stories like that. But one feature of this story shocked me to my core. The entertainment had been arranged to celebrate a boy's birthday. This pitiless, wicked scene was a birthday party. All over the Roman world, circuses like this were organised to celebrate the birthday of the emperor's son. Now, just imagine a world where the British government opened up the big football stadia across England, and in honour of Prince George's birthday, we all troop into the Emirates Stadium or Anfield or Old Trafford so that we can enjoy the sight of a young woman dressed in white being torn to pieces by wild animals. The values of the Roman Empire were alien because the Romans were unspeakably cruel. Now, all the ancient civilizations were cruel, of course. Human life was just a cheap commodity.
Yeah, it's almost impossible for us to grasp the emotional life of people like that. I mean, it's just shocking, unspeakable. It wasn't just the circuses that were cruel. So many aspects of Roman life make no sense to us. For example, the whole empire was built on slavery. Women were regarded as property owned by men. A man could have sex with any of his slaves at any time, and that included young boys as well as women. The whole culture seems to have been about power and wealth. Virtues like pity or compassion were despised.
250 years before Perpetua's martyrdom, wealthy Romans had heated swimming pools. But don't let that sophistication fool us. Some aspects of Roman culture can only be described, I think, as satanic. I'm going to read you a fragment of a letter written by a Roman nobleman to his pregnant wife. I remain in Alexandria. I ask and beg you to take good care of our baby son, and as soon as I receive payment, I shall send it up to you. If you are delivered of a child before I come home, if it is a boy, keep it. If a girl, discard it. It was entirely lawful and normal to leave a girl or a disabled boy out in the woods to be eaten by animals. And it happened so often that Rome had a much higher percentage of men than women. Even in large families, there was rarely more than one daughter.
When we think of the value system of the Roman Empire, we can begin to see why so many regarded the Christian gospel as radical and even scandalous.
Now, it wasn't the idea of a human being ascending into heaven or a human being somehow also being divine that shocked the Romans. They would have been okay with that, provided that the central figure of Christianity had been a powerful, victorious hero. The aspect of the Christian gospel that made a Roman's head melt was the cross. They found the central idea of the cross to be grotesque, obscene, and ridiculous. It's only been in the past year or so, Ollie, as we have done these endless podcasts on things like critical race theory, that I have really begun to appreciate just how subversive the Christian gospel really is. It is the cross that subverts human power. And perhaps we will only preach the gospel effectively in our own culture if the cross becomes as scandalous to critical race theorists as it was to the ancient Romans. Because at the heart of both ideologies is a worship of human power.
And of course, the gospel did a lot more than merely subvert power. It offered individuals, even the lowest in society, salvation. It offered them forgiveness and acceptance and hope. It taught them that they were loved by God. It gave them dignity as individuals. And it was the unique message of salvation that saw Christian communities spring up in all the major cities of the empire.
I get really emotional, I have to confess, when I read the stories of the early church. I mean, they lived such distinctive lives. You get this sense of an intense, loving community. Just to give you an example, the empire had to endure a couple of terrible plagues in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They might have been caused by smallpox and then measles. We don't quite know. But we do know that a huge percentage of the Roman population died. And the pagans shook their heads in disbelief at how the Christians nursed their sick and cared for their pagan neighbours, putting themselves at terrible risk. You see, the normal response was literally to throw the sick and dying out into the street, even family members, in order to escape infection. But the statistics show that far larger numbers of Christians survived these plagues than in the general population because of the nursing care that was given.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a wonderful illustration of Christian distinctiveness, isn't it? We've already touched on the status of women in Roman society, but isn't it true that Christian teaching on the sanctity of marriage and the dignity it conferred on women was a major reason why so many women converted to Christianity? Exactly
right. I mean, some scholars think that 70% of Paul's churches were made up of women. The statistics are really insightful here. 50% of Christian women married after their 18th birthday. Now, that was an astonishing figure in a culture where the legal age of marriage for a girl was 12. There was quite a debate at the time about the ethics of a husband having intercourse with his wife before she reached puberty. But the radical thing about Christian teaching on sexuality was that it removed the double standard on the subject of chastity. Men had to be as chaste as much as women. And the result of Christian teaching, Christian marriages were stable and lasting. Christian marriages started to produce more children than non-Christian marriages, and so the numbers of Christians in society grew at an astonishing rate.
A few minutes ago, you told us that terrible story about the Christian martyr called Perpetua. How common was persecution in the early history of the church?
Well, we shouldn't think that persecution was this sort of continual, uninterrupted phenomenon. The life of the church at this time could best be described as long periods of marginalization with the occasional spike of outright persecution. So for long decades, Christians could expect to, lose their privileges in society or to be turned into slaves. But then there were these spikes of persecution. And now in the 2nd century, those spikes tended to be geographically localized. It's not until you get to the 3rd century where there are two particularly grievous periods of persecution that were empire-wide. And the worst period, which is well known to you, of course, occurred just after 300 AD. Emperor Diocletian had actually been quite a good emperor who had let Christian expansion take place without interference. He even had a wife and a daughter who were Christians. But for reasons no one quite understands, he issued a series of edicts commanding officials to destroy church buildings, prohibit Christian worship, and burn the scriptures. Bishops were rounded up wholesale, imprisoned, tortured, and many put to death. And so many ordinary Christians were killed and maimed that eventually the Romans sickened themselves with their bloodletting.
Within a few short years, of course, the situation completely turned around, and a new emperor called Constantine converted to Christianity and made Christianity the state religion.
Yeah, I mean, that event must go down in history as one of the most dramatic turnarounds of all time. In the year 325, Constantine presided over a council of the church. I'm talking about the famous Council of Nicaea that tried to resolve the Arian controversy. And anyway, the point is this. Many of the Christian leaders who reclined on couches beside the emperor, they were eating their meal using hands that had been scarred and maimed by the tortures they'd received just a few years earlier.
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? And by this stage in the story, Christianity had moved at incredible speed from being an obscure Jewish sect to being the official religion of the Roman state. So in terms of numbers and in terms of political influence, the rise of Christianity is absolutely astonishing. But you said at the start of our conversation, Jim, that you wanted to focus on the development of ideas. Is there any evidence at this early stage of the church's history that what we might call a Christian worldview is beginning to take shape?
I think there is. Tom Holland has a lovely story in his book called Dominion about a later emperor called Julian the Apostate. He ruled about 20 years after Constantine's death. He was actually his nephew. Now, Julian detested Christianity. He was determined to reverse all of Constantine's legislation and return Rome to the worship of the ancient pagan gods. And in one of his letters, he railed against those who had abandoned the ever-living gods for the corpse of the Jew. Now, of course, his efforts failed, as we know. But anyway, on one occasion, Julian visited the province of Galatia. And he was shocked to see the temple to the main pagan god of that region in such a state of disrepair. The paint had flaked from the statues of the god. The whole temple complex looked abandoned. And so he wrote a letter to the Galatians, just as the Apostle Paul had done 300 years earlier. But of course, Julian the Apostate was writing to the priest of the pagan temple. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. Julian berates the priest for not doing enough to promote the cult of the pagan gods of Galatia. You need to start a welfare program for the needy and the destitute, he scolded. Julian set aside a very considerable sum of money to support this program, and he instructed the priests how to distribute it to the poor, to travellers and beggars. And in his letter, Julian urges the high priest to teach his priests to do good works. Teach them, he said, teach them that doing good works was our practice of old. Now, this assertion would have come as news to the priests, because their cult had never had anything to do with good works or welfare programs. It centred on ecstatic dancing, cross-dressing, and self-castration. The cult practiced a form of transgenderism, which is actually why Paul makes a joke about self-castration in his letter to the Galatians. Anyway, the practice of old, to use Julian's phrase, was actually to despise the poor and round up beggars. So the interesting thing about that story, Ollie, is that Julian, even though he was fiercely antagonistic to Christianity, was thinking and arguing like a Christian. Yeah? So that's just one example of how the Christian worldview, with its emphasis on the immutable dignity of every human individual, began to undermine the cruel values of the old Roman Empire.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Jim, and it's fascinating as well because he didn't even appreciate the source of his newfound morality. Before we bring this episode to an end, Jim, I want to think about what we might call the internal history of the church. We've discussed the spreading influence of the church on wider society, but a lot of the material on the early church deals with its internal struggles against heresy and the creation of what we might call orthodoxy through the big councils of the 4th and 5th centuries. This perspective on the early church has become very controversial in recent years because the traditional story has been challenged. Traditionally, it was believed that at the start there were authentic Christian doctrines, the doctrines that we find in the New Testament documents. But in the early centuries, these true doctrines had to survive attacks from heretical ideas. So in the 2nd century, there was a big struggle with the philosophical ideas called Gnosticism. Later on, heretical ideas such as Arianism came along that attacked the idea of Christ's deity. But the way we used to tell the story was of an authentic set of beliefs that survived attack from alien philosophies. in more recent times, critical scholars have challenged that view. The idea of an authentic set of beliefs is incorrect, they say. The distinction between orthodoxy and heresy is something Christians manufactured later on. The reality, we are told, was that in the early days of the church, a set of competing beliefs existed. And the thing we call orthodoxy is just the heresy that eventually won the day. So we call Arianism a heresy because that belief system lost out in a political power struggle. If the political winds had blown in the opposite direction, Trinitarianism would be called heretical.
Yeah, the guy who first floated that theory was a theologian called Walter Bauer, presumably related to Jack Bauer, I don't know. Anyway, it's become very popular with theologians on the progressive left today because it fits in with a fashionable cultural narrative. The church is portrayed as this patriarchal, repressive institution which crushed the dissenting voices of oppressed minorities. So what is happening, of course, is that critical theory is being read back into church history. It's a complete waste of time, of course. There's a feminist theologian called Elaine Pagel, or Pagel perhaps, and she argues that the Gospel of Thomas was suppressed by the church patriarchy in order to consolidate the role of men in the church. Now, that thesis is mind-numbingly stupid because the Gospel of Thomas is one of the most misogynistic texts ever written. It claims that the only way a woman can enter heaven is if she changes herself into a man.
And you get the same ideas promoted in the Da Vinci Code, the novel by Dan Brown. I'll just quote a bit of the dialogue from the book to make that point. The heroine in the story is a girl called Sophie, and she is shocked when a so-called expert called Teabing tells her that the church only decided that Jesus was divine after the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. My dear, Teabing declared, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, a mortal. Not the Son of God? Asked Sophie. Right, Teabing said. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea. Hold on. You're saying that Jesus' divinity was the result of a vote? A relatively close one at that, Teabing added.
Now, that dialogue is a collection of simple, straightforward lies. First of all, the vote he's talking about was unanimous or almost unanimous. But much more importantly, the church believed in Jesus' deity and his immortality from its earliest days. We're talking about evidence that's perhaps months after our Lord's crucifixion. Even the most critical of scholars now acknowledge that truth. Alistair McGrath has an excellent introductory book on the subject of heresies, and he presents strong historical arguments for what is called a proto-orthodoxy that was in place by the end of the 2nd century. And the hard work we have already done in this episode, Ollie, provides, I think, an even stronger counter-argument to Walter Bauer and his followers. Because remember that a good number of these heresies had been dealt with by the church before it had any political power at all. So the idea that orthodoxy is just one more heresy that won a political power struggle in the 5th century is unsupported by the historical data. The best way to understand all these theological controversies of the first 5 centuries is to remember that only the truth stands. False ideas always fall down, eventually. Only the truth stands. That's really the only way to explain how orthodoxy emerged in the church. Now, sometimes it takes a long time for false ideas to be discarded. I personally think that far too much Greek philosophy was entertained by theologians in the early centuries of the church. Someone famously said, "We have too much grease in our heads." So just to take one example, for a very, very long time, it was said that God in himself was unable to suffer. Now, that is a Greek idea, not a biblical one. But it's really only been in relatively recent times that theologians have eventually ditched the unscriptural idea of divine impassibility.
So your argument against the critical scholars who dismiss the idea of an orthodox set of beliefs that existed from New Testament times is maybe summed up in the line from the book of Jude, which talks of the faith given once to the saints. But God then allowed his truth to be tested by a whole set of competing ideas. And in the end, Jim, what you're saying is only the truth was left standing.
Yeah, that's right. It's really interesting, to contrast Christianity's historical pathway with the history of Islam. In Islamic history, a political structure called a caliphate was formed very early on. Now, Islam had a number of variants of the Quran floating around. So the Quran used by Muslims in Iraq was different from the one used in Syria. That's just an example. And the Caliphate sorted that problem out by announcing which variant was the right one. And they then ordered that all the variants be collected up and destroyed by burning them or pouring acid over them. So Islamic orthodoxy was enforced by political authority. But the Christian story cannot be explained in that way. In fact, you need to believe in miracles to explain it. You need to believe that only the truth is left standing.
It can be quite unnerving for young Christians to learn that the creeds that set out the doctrines of Christ and the Trinity don't come along until the 4th and 5th centuries. Why is that?
Well, that sort of question makes primitivists like me smile and shrug our shoulders. I mean, what are the creeds after all? I mean, they deserve our deep respect, of course, but they aren't inspired. The best way to understand the Nicene Creed of 381 or the Chalcedonian Creed is to see them a bit like hedges that protect a safe space. They're boundary markers, if you like, that protect the mysteries of the faith.
And what do you mean by that phrase, the mysteries of faith?
Well, I don't mean anything spooky or mystical. I simply mean that there are some aspects of reality that cannot, by definition, be fully grasped by a human mind. The person of Christ or the inner life of God are two examples. So the Bible has been inspired to help us approach those realities in such a way that they can be spiritually apprehended through fellowship and worship with God.
And so the creeds you've mentioned guide us in our understanding of these mysteries. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Now, sometimes when you dive into the real detail, into the very depths of the creeds, you might raise an eyebrow over some clauses that seem to go beyond Scripture. But as a general principle, it's very unwise to step outside of the boundaries they have put in place. Remember that the truth about Christ's nature and the truth about God's inner life, those truths are laid down for us within the Scriptures themselves. The creeds were never designed to add anything to Scripture. They just protect us from interpreting it wrongly. So I'm very glad that we have them. But the fact that they were written centuries after the canon was completed seems to me to be irrelevant.
Brilliant, Jim. Well, I've really enjoyed this first episode of our mini-series on church history. Thanks so much for all the time and effort you've put into studying these things. In our next episode, we'll delve into the weird world of the Middle Ages. I'm particularly looking forward to that one, Jim. I know you've got some fascinating tales from the Middle Ages. And during that, we'll be looking at the period of history between 500 AD and 1000 AD. But for now, we're finished, and I'll let you get back to cleaning your house so you don't get into trouble.